Hello everyone. In this lesson, we are going to learn how you can integrate Microsoft DevOps tools like Visual Studio or Team Foundation Server and VSTS or the Visual Studio Team Services with AWS Elastic Beanstalk. My name is Srivan Tattanayaka and I'm a partner solution architect at Emerson Web Services. So what's the agenda for today? I'm going to give you a very quick introduction into AWS Elastic Beanstalk. AWS Elastic Beanstalk itself is a very complex subject. You can learn it for days, but what I'm going to present is the absolute necessities that you want to know to understand the subsequent demos. Then I'm going to deploy a .NET MVC application to an IIS, and I'm going to use AWS tools for Microsoft Visual Studio Team Services. So I'm going to use the hosted version of Team Services. And also I'm going to use Elastic Beanstalk in this deployment. In the next iteration, I'm going to improve the deployment I did, and I'm going to use PowerShell, Elastic Beanstalk, and Microsoft Team Foundation Server. The last demo that I'm going to do, you will see that how you can customize different deployments where it will automatically provision environments depending on the build configuration that you have set up. So let's get started. Let's get to know Elastic Beanstalk very quickly. To understand Elastic Beanstalk, you need to understand the kind of workloads that you try to manage with Elastic Beanstalk. You can manage your web server environments mainly. You can manage your worker environments or worker processes. You can also manage your database environments. But mainly you can think of Elastic Beanstalk as a way to manage your front-end web servers. So in Elastic Beanstalk, you focus on your application. For example, if you have a .NET MVC application, you focus on creating that application. So all the heavy lifting of managing the IIS web servers, the operating system, things like patching, making sure that your application is properly load balanced, making sure that when you are upgrading the application version or your code with a different feature set, that it gracefully upgrade the infrastructure are taken care of for you by Elastic Beanstalk. So how does the Elastic Beanstalk looks like? So here I'm in my my Elastic Beanstalk console of AWS. You can find that the first abstraction that you find in Elastic Beanstalk is what we call the application. So here I have like two applications, one called my cat application and another called my tiger application. So within that application, I can have multiple environments. In this case, my cat application has one environment called VSTS prod. And in my tiger application, I have three environments, one for development, one for production, and one for test environment. Okay. So you can have multiple applications and multiple environments. Each application can have different versions. So if I go into my tiger application, I can deploy different version of my software into that, right? So these are the different versions. For example, I have deployed into my tiger application. If I want to spin up a new environment, it's a matter of like selecting, for example, going back to an old version, and then I can click deploy, right? When I click a deploy, I can select which environment I want to deploy it and click deploy. That the solution will get deployed very quickly into that. Okay. I can also control, for example, in the application level, like how many application versions I need to keep. In this case, I'm going to keep 200 versions of my application, right? I can set how many days I want to keep the application when I try to delete it, right? You can select which S3 bucket that you're going to keep it and so on, right? I can select some saved configuration here that will say, hey, how is my load balancing looks like, how is my EC2 instance sizing looks like, and then saved it here. And then once I saved it here, I can launch an environment based on that, right? So based on the saved configuration, I can, for example, load an existing version of my application, right? And create the environment if I want. Okay. So let's go back to this Elastic Beanstalk. So within an environment, for example, if I go into this my TigerApp production, you can get like details of this environment. So here you can find a summary of events that happens in the environment. If I go into monitoring, I can see how many requests I'm getting, my CPU utilization, and so on, right? So this is very helpful. Like if you have a web server environment, you can get all this information without logging into your machine. Of course, if you want to access the site, you can go here and then click this URL, and you will have this page that will give you the site that you want to access. Okay, you can access the logs if you want. So here you can request, for example, the first 100 lines. So it will go there and then generate these logs for you. The configuration, like for example, you can change, like I want to have set up this environment. You can just go ahead and, for example, select different instances size if you like. You can select what security groups you want to have, what encryption keys that you want to use. You can select the instance profile so that the EC2 instance will have different permissions within the AWS, how much storage you allocate, and so on, right? So these configurations, you don't need to set everything when you are deploying. It's up to you to configure them, or you can use the default. For example, the health check URL, right? What kind of deployment that you want to have? Do you want to have rolling updates, right? For example, which network that you want to deploy this iOS website, right? So you can go into detail of this configuration if you like, but if you don't want to go through, like for example, if you are using these environments for the purpose of development, you may not be interested in setting all these parameters, right? So in that case, it's very easy to still go there and create an environment. For example, if I go here and then create an environment, I select I want to have a web server environment. You can create, for example, worker environments also. Let's go into web server environment and then select it. It asks only a few parameters. Let's say this is going to be my TigerApp pre-production, right? Production, right? So I can use the pre-configured platform if I want, right? .NET in this case, or I can select a custom platform. I can deploy a sample application, or I can deploy an existing version of this application, right? So that's all what you need to create an environment. So once I click next, it will go there and then provision this environment for me, right? Later you can customize it based on whether you want to have load balancers, how your security group's going to be like. You can customize them later if you like. So if I go into my TigerApp, now you have another IIS environment created for you. So you can deploy like different versions of your application into this new environment. Another cool thing that you can see is that once you have these environments, like you can swap the URLs. For example, if I go here and then click swap URLs, I can point, for example, my development environment into my production environment. So that gives you the ability to do blue-green deployment, where you first deploy your solution into, let's say, a test environment, and then once you have done the testing, you can just swap the URLs, and you can make your test environment the production environment, and the production environment the test environment. So that gives you minimum downtime when you do the deployment. So that's a rough idea about Elastic Beanstalk. So if I go into my home page, you can find that this is a sample MVC application that I have deployed. So you know how Elastic Beanstalk works. What I'm going to showcase you next is how you can integrate this whole application provisioning with TFS or VSTS. So what we are going to do, I'm going to demo you like two sample applications. Pretty much they look the same. One is called my cat application, which I'm going to deploy using VSTS, or the hosted version of the Team Foundation server. And then I'm going to deploy another similar application called my Tiger application. They are all very simple MVC.NET application. So how does it looks like? So we have the Elastic Beanstalk. I'm going to bring Visual Studio, Team Foundation server, or VSTS, and going to integrate all these components, right? How does the deployment flow looks like? So I have this Visual Studio solution with the ASP.NET MVC application. I'm going to commit the changes into VSTS and TFS, and these changes will then deploy this application to an Elastic Beanstalk, and behind the scene Elastic Beanstalk use an EC2 instance to host this IIS website. So that's the rough idea, and I'll showcase you how you do it with a demo. I'm in my Visual Studio of this CAT application. This is a very simple .NET MVC application that I created with the default Visual Studio sample. One way to deploy this application is to right click from Visual Studio and then click Publish to Elastic Beanstalk. So once you install the Visual Studio tools from AWS, you get these features. You get some project templates also. You can go and then click project. You get like different project templates from AWS. But this is a very simple web application that I created just by going into new project. I select Visual C#. I select a MSC ASP.NET web application. So this is the Microsoft provided template that I used to create it. But behind the scene, it knows that this is a web application that I can publish into Elastic Beanstalk. Okay, so if I go into here, I can select like what's the account I'm going to use. I can see like different environments I already have. I can select one of these environment, click next. I can select what kind of runtime I want to have, click next, and then click deploy, and it will get deployed. So that's what we want to do if you want to deploy through your development environment. But we want to do more, right? So what we want to do is, so this is already in VSTS. What I want to do is to make this build from VSTS and then publish into Elastic Beanstalk, right? So if I go into my VSTS configuration, so I already have a project created, my CAT application, and I have some builds defined for that. Okay. So if I go into the build definition that I have created, so you can create a new build definition if you like by clicking here, add a new one. I can, for example, create an empty one. So you can add like different build steps, right? What I did was I already created a build definition. So in this case, my CAT application Elastic Beanstalk build. So if I go into that, I can edit it. So I already deployed a few Elastic Beanstalk applications for a trial run. If I go into that, you can find that I have added few steps. Of course, the first step is that I take it from the repository. I get the NuGet packages, all my third-party libraries. I build the solution. So these are all like default Visual Studio, VSTS build artifacts, build steps or build task. So I publish this one into that, and then I run some PowerShell scripts to write some default these parameters into the console, so I know like where my build agent dump these files. So the important step here is this task that I added called deploy to Elastic Beanstalk, right? So how did I get this task? It's very simple. If you go into add task, if you check out your marketplace, right, you can find that we have added a few tools in the marketplace, right? So if I search for AWS, you'll find that there is some AWS marketplace toolkit that we have added, right? So one of these one is AWS tools for Microsoft Visual Studio Team Services. So once you install this, it will install in your environment, and then you can add these different tasks. So you have like task for execute AWS CLI or the command line commands. You can execute CloudFormation templates, create update stack. There's one video that I've already created to demonstrate how you can integrate CloudFormation with TFS. Of course, you can execute a cloud deployment application. There's another video that I did, so you can have a look how you can use this task. Then you have like Elastic Beanstalk deployment. You can do a Lambda deployment of serverless functions. You can invoke Lambda function. You can download or upload some content into S3, right? So in this case, I'm going to use this AWS Elastic Beanstalk deployment. I give it a name, then I add which credential that this task will use to contact AWS, right? What I did was I went into IAM user, and then I created a new user that this build task can use. I gave it like programmatic access. So if I go into my users, I add a new user. So I call it, let's say, VSTS service user, right? I gave it programmatic access. Then I go into next permission. I add permission so that this VSTS job has permission to execute Elastic Beanstalk task, right? You can customize like which permissions that you want to give, or you can give full access to Elastic Beanstalk. So these are like manage Elastic Beanstalk. So you can give like different permissions, or you can use this manage permission to the task. So I gave the permissions. You can customize the level of access you want to give, and then you complete the task, create the user. So once I create the user, of course, I get some credentials. So I get a secret access key and some access key ID and a secret access key. So of course I'm going to delete that soon. So what I'm going to do is like I'm going to copy these values, right? And if I go into my TFS, I can create like a new account over here, and I can give like a this secret access key, and I can add these values, right, into this build task, so that the hosted version of the TFS can communicate with it, right? Test, and you click OK, and I already created this user called Srivanth account, right? And then I select the region that I want to deploy this, and also I select the zip which build artifact that I want to deploy, right? So this is nothing more than an IIS web deployment package that you can use to deploy into IIS website. You give it the application name. So here it identifies which application it wants to deploy and the environment that it wants to deploy. So in this case, I have an application called my cat application. So that corresponds to this cat application, and I have a environment called VSTS prod, right? So if I go into, these are the parameters that I set it up there, right? So once this is set up, it's a matter of like kickstarting a build that will deploy this application into AWS, right? So what I'm going to do now is to, so I have make some modification into this page. I'm going to make these changes and then commit. So let's call version 1 of the application. So I'm going to commit and push these changes into TFS, sorry, the VSTS. So as part of this one, it will automatically kickstart a new build. So let's see what happens. So now the build is in progress. So if I go into this build definition, you can find that it started building this. So it's executing like different steps. So as of now, it's using these hosted agents. So it will start these build steps. And so now it's getting the source code. It's downloading the good packages. It's after a while, it will start building the solution. If there's any test assemblies, it will execute next. Then of course it will, you can add some tasks. So what I'm interested is in this Elastic Beanstalk deployment task, right? So once this get executed, what will happen is if you go into the console, you can find that this one which was now in green will turn into gray because a new application start deploying, right? So let's see what is happening here. So it's still So if I go into the VSTS prod, so now it started deploying this solution into the Elastic Beanstalk. Now it turned out to be gray because the new application is updating. So depending on whether your environment is load balanced or whether you have enabled rolling update, it will gracefully upgrade your system, right? So if I go into my cat application, you can find that it has more versions now. So this is the old version. It will upgrade into the new version that I published at this time. Okay. After a while, you will find these changes appearing in your application. It takes some time to go there and update. So what it does is it copy these files into IIS folders and then bring it online. So after a while, you can find that the environment became green. And if you go into the environment, you can find that the VST prod is green now. And if I click this URL, you can find the new changes or the website being provisioned. Behind the scene, what happens is Elastic Beanstalk actually accept a web deployment package. This is the same package that you would get if you go here and then click publish. And then let's say custom, let's say my web deploy. So let's say you create a web deployment package and you save it under, let's say ctemp. And if you click here and then if you publish it, you get a web deployment package, right? It's the same one that Elastic Beanstalk accept as its package content. So this has your views, your scripts, your DLLs, everything is inside this, right? So this is what the package that Elastic Beanstalk accept. Previously, when we used VSTS build task, we used already predefined AWS Elastic build task. That's fine if you want to have a very simple Elastic Beanstalk application deployment. If you want to get more fine-grained control, for example, depending on different build artifacts, if you want to dynamically spin up new environments, if you want to dynamically set up some environments, decommission them, create new application versions and so on, you need to do that with PowerShell. So in the next demo, what I'm going to showcase you is how you can get more fine-grained control with PowerShell and Elastic Beanstalk. In this case, I'm going to use again the Visual Studio. The application is pretty much the same. The only difference is we are going to call this application my Tiger application, right? Application version 1, right? It's a simple ASP.NET web application. This also goes into TFS. The only difference is how I have set up my build configuration, right? So if I go into my build configuration and I edit it, you can find that I have defined a few build steps. Of course, the first one is that I get the project, I get the NuGet packages, restore them, and then I use MS build definition and I point into my C# project, right? And once I point into C# project, I use MS build to build it. I build as, for example, whatever the platform that I like to build it. And this is what defines what kind of platform I want to have, configuration here. These are all build time parameters. The important thing is that I pass this argument called T package. So this will create the web deployment package. Because I'm using this the MS build, the raw MS build to do that, I need to pass this parameter to build a web deployment package. The next steps are very simple. So I do the testing if I have any test assemblies. I publish the PDB files, do some file copy. So this is also important. I copy all the artifacts into the staging directory, right? So here I have one called staging directory, and then what I do is I upload this zip file, the web deployment package, into S3, right? So I already have a bucket called S3, and in the S3 called S3 build artifact. So here you can find that my S3 bucket called S3 build artifact, and there I have a folder called my Tiger app, and this is where I'm going to upload all my build artifacts as part of TFS build process, right? So different versions get uploaded here. So if I go into my build package again, so I upload these zip files, this zip file as into my folder called my Tiger app, and then I give the build source version, build number. So here I can track which version of TFS get uploaded into my S3 bucket, right? The next thing I do is, of course, these are like some console outputs that I'm doing, so I can get which configuration I'm using, which staging directory I'm using. The next important thing is this one. So I want to get more fine-grained control over my deployment. So therefore, I do this deployment with PowerShell, right? I'm executing the PowerShell. I give the file path, and I point it to one of the PowerShell script in my solution, right? So if I go into my Visual Studio, this PowerShell script is given here, my elastic Beanstalk .ps1, right? So let's investigate what it does. So it accepts few parameters. So these parameters, I pass it in the TFS. For example, these are the parameters that I'm passing. You can pass the build time parameters if you like. So I pass a couple of parameters, and then I use AWS PowerShell commandlets to manipulate my elastic Beanstalk environment. For what I'm doing is, for example, I first get the elastic Beanstalk application with the application name app name, right? So if I go into my TFS, you can find that I pass the app name as my Tiger app. Okay. So I take the application name. If there is an application that is already existing, right, I continue. If not, I'm going to create a new EB application, right? The previously, for example, when I deployed my cat application in my environment, so if I go into my elastic Beanstalk environment, you can find that it already had this my cat application, right? With the PowerShell, I can even assume that my environment does not exist or my application does not exist. I'll showcase you shortly, like where I'm going to delete this everything. And with the power of PowerShell, I can spin up these environments dynamically. So I check whether my environment application exists. If not, I'm going to create a new EB application. After that, what I'm going to do is check whether the application version with this application version exists or not, right? If the current version exists, I go next to the next step. If there's no such application version, what I'm going to do is create a new application version, right? I of course give the name of the application, a version name. This version name I construct with the help of TFS build parameters and pass it to here. I give it a description, auto create application. Then I pass the S3 bucket name where I can get the application, and then I say process, so it will do some validation, right? Then what I do is when this application version get updated into elastic Beanstalk, until it get uploaded into elastic Beanstalk, it will not be in a consistent state. So I repeatedly check whether the application comes into the state called processed, right? So if the application version comes into this state called processed, I proceed next, or otherwise I wait a bit of time and I check the status of that application again, right? So that's if that application version does not exist. I go next. Then I check some conditions. I check whether the environment terminated is true or false, right? Because at the time of this deployment, it may be the case that somebody already delete this environment, right? So I want to make sure if somebody is deleting this environment that I finish that delete pass first and then continue, right? So what I do is, so I check first, I assume that application environment is not in the deleting state. I go to Elastic Beanstalk and get the EB environment for the application, in this case my Tiger app, right? And in this case my development or production environment, right? So these parameters I pass as part of the build process. So what I do is, if there is no any application environment, like for example previously we assumed this application environment exists, right? It may be the case at the time this TFS build task runs, these application environments may not even exist, right? And what I do next is check whether the environment that we want to have exists or not, right? I'll showcase you the advantage of doing that later. So if there's no such environment enabled, what I do is I spin up a new EB environment. I give it which application I want to spin this environment. I give it a name, I give the description, and I give the solution stack I want to start it. So in this case, it's going to be a 64-bit Windows Server Core 2016 with these versions, right? You can also give a template name and then specify details like how many EC2 instances you want to have, the sizing, the load balancing, the encryption keys to use, and so on. But in this case, I just use this solution stack name. You can go into detail of these commandlets to understand. There's a nice documentation to understand the capabilities of them, right? So I spin up this environment, and after that what I do is I'm waiting for that application environment to come alive, right? To do that, what I do is I get the EB environment, I get the application and the name, and I exclude all the deleted environments and then check whether the environment is ready or not. Because from the time that you create a new EB environment, it takes some time to start that environment. It needs to start the EC2 instance, it needs to go through the Windows boot up process and so on. So if the application is not ready, it waits for some time and then it continues in a loop. So if everything is good, what will happen is when the application comes into the ready state, it will go to the next stages. So the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to do some, if everything is good and if the environment is not terminating or terminated, right? What I'm going to do is I'm going to update the environment with the application, right? So I update the environment with the application, I pass some parameters and make sure that the application is in the ready mode when I do the update. Okay. After that, if everything is good, I continues. So here there is a one check that I'm doing. The reason why I'm doing is there can be a situation where at the time of this TFS build task, somebody delete this environment, right? So if that's the case, what I do is I wait a bit and then wait until the environment is completely terminated, right? And I go again and then try this process, right? So at the time of this deployment, for some reason, if somebody goes there and they delete it, this script will wait for that delete to complete, and of course it will go here and then set up the environment again. So that's what this PowerShell script is doing. It gives you more control over what you can do. So first let's deploy a normal application when this environment already exists, and then we will do another deployment when this application or the environment does not exist. So you'll get a feeling of how to dynamically create this environment with PowerShell. So I'm now in my Tiger application over here. So what I'm going to do is I have already made some modification into my page, and I'm going to commit those changes into TFS. Let's call it this one, version 1. So let's commit these changes and then push them. So once I do that, the TFS will start a build process. So it has already started one. So let's go into this and then check what is happening. So right now it's getting the source code from the repository. It's getting the NuGet packages, building the solution with TFS the MS build, running some test cases, publishing the symbols. So this is where you can find that it has packaged the application. Now it's loading the PowerShell modules to upload the content into S3 bucket. Now it's executing the script that I have defined before, right? So as part of the script, now you can find that the create a new EB application version, this one, Tiger application. So this is all coming from that PowerShell script, and now it's waiting for the environment my Tiger app div to come to the ready state. So if I go into my Elastic Beanstalk application, so earlier it was green. So if I refresh this, you can find that my Tiger application development environment is gray now, because it has started deploying the application into this environment. After a while, this will become healthy, and once it becomes healthy, this waiting task will identify the environment is healthy, and it will complete the build process. After a couple of minutes, you can find that the health has turned out to green, and if I go into this link, you can find the changes that I have made it. So before that, let's go into my Tiger app, and then I go into my my Tiger app application versions. You can find that this is the build it has made, 2_87. If I go into my TFS, you can find that if I go here, the latest build version is this one, 2017-9.8, and the version is 2, right? And so this is the ID, and you can easily identify with the date and the build version here. So you can easily relate like which version of TFS build that this version of application got built. So this is my Tiger application version 1, right? So far so good. Now let's say imagine that we have a situation that at the time of this build that this environment does not exist at all, right? In that case, we need to spin up this environment automatically. So how can we do that? So one way to do that is to use some build parameters. For example, if I go into my build configuration and edit it, you can find that the environment name I have parameterized. So if you go into my PowerShell script that calls the PowerShell script in the in my code base, you can find that for the app environment name, what I do is I have this string called my Tiger app, and then I concatenate it with something called EB environment. So this EB environment is not a default TFS variable. So it's a custom variable that I have defined. So if you go under the variables, you can find that I have defined a custom variable called development or div, right? So if the advantage of having like this kind of a design is if I want to spin up a new environment, it's a matter of changing this parameter. So for example, if I go here and then give a new build, so instead of development, let's say I call this one as test test environment, let's say ABC, right? Test environment A, let's say. So if you go into my set of environments, you can see that I don't have any environment called test A. So these are the environments that I have right now. So I can simply set this one, and then I can queue a new build, and it will automatically spin up a new environment on behalf of me, right? So it's again building the application, the same process of building my application. So shortly we'll see a new environment appearing here. Let's wait for a moment. If you go here, part of this PowerShell description, you can find that waiting the environment my TIGAP test A become ready for my TIGAP. So this is a new step that this script executes. And if I refresh this page, I should see a new environment appearing. Let's check that. Here you can find that new environment. So what will happen is now it spin up a new environment. It's spinning up new EC2 instances. And once they become alive, this environment will have the new version of the software. So that's a very cool way of spinning up new environments dynamically. If you go into these new environments that get provisioned, you can find like different stages that it undergoes. It creates these load balancers, security groups. So it's not just spinning up EC2 instance, it does a whole bunch of other things to make this the IIS environment available for you. The other thing you need to notice is that these environments are backed by EC2 instances, and you can find these EC2 instances if you go into EC2 console. So for example, my VST production environment is here, and my TIGAP app prod environment machines are over here. So as of now, I used only a single instances. The way to identify these instances are like by looking at this name, and also if you go into tags, you can find that they have added a few tags as part of it. So through this one, you can identify which EC2 and which Elastic Beanstalk environments that this machine belongs to. As I said before, of course, these machines are managed by Elastic Beanstalks, but it does not prevent you logging into or remote desktoping into these applications, right? Some machines you can configure with encryption key so that you can retrieve the Windows password to remote login. But for a production environment, what you can do is you don't need to set up these password or the encryption key, so that you cannot get a password for those machines, so you cannot remote login. So it depends on your requirements. You can set up this encryption key. The way to set this one up is very simple. You go to, for example, one of these environment, and in the instance configuration, if you go into the configuration, you can set up what the KMS key to use. So for example, in this environment, I haven't set up a EC2 key pair, but if I set up an already existing key, using this key, I can remote login into those machines. If you go into this environment called VST prod, you can find that I have configured the EC2 instances to have an encryption key, right? So for example, in this case, it used this EC2 key pair Shri kiosk. So using this, I can get the password for this machine. So this environment has spin up one EC2 instances, and that is over here. So I can go here and then get the Windows password. So I can browse into my key pair, and I can decrypt the password to get Windows password. Just having the password is not enough. The other thing you need to set up is, if you select this EC2 instance, you also, if you want to do remote login, you need to make sure that you enable the security group. So in this case, if I go into this security group, I want to make sure that I have the inbound rules properly set up to enable the RDP connections. So what I'm going to do now is to set up the RDP connection. And I'm going to point into anywhere so that I can remote login into that. And let's go into EC2 instance and then try to remote login into that. So this is my machine. I'm going to connect, get the remote desktop connection. I have already copied my password from the previous description, so I'm going to paste it, and should be a long password, and click OK. So I can remote login into these Windows administrate the Windows machine, although they are managed by Elastic Beanstalk. So if I go into my IIS website, for example, let's go into C drive. You can find that it has an inet pub root www. You can find this my cat app deploy folder is there, and your content is over here. Right, so you can still access these machines, like in case you have some special bugs that you need to find. So nothing prevents you accessing them. It's a matter of letting Elastic Beanstalk to manage this application, or whether you prefer to do some administrative task inside. After a while, you can find this my TIGAP test environment A that we spin up dynamically came alive. So if I go into this URL, you will find that new TIGAP application has been provisioned in this URL. Right. So that's how you can dynamically spin up environments. So let's for the moment delete all these environments and then see what if we don't have an application altogether. Right, so let's delete all of this environment that I have spin up. Let's terminate this environment. So every time when you are terminating an environment, you need to specify the name, because we don't want to accidentally delete an environment that you have already provisioned. So what I'm going to do now is to terminate all this environment that I have created. The other question is, right now I have my two applications called my cat application and my TIG application. We can also do another trick. For example, if I go into my TFS and go to my build definition and I edit it. So here you can find that in the PowerShell script that I deploy this, I define the application as my TIG app, right? Let's call it as my dog app for the moment, right? So let's call it my dog app in the script. So that will be the new application name. So if you look at my Elastic Beanstalk environment, you don't find any application called my dog app. So if I change this in my environment, in my the build machine, and then save it and queue it, what will happen is it will spin up a new application, and also it will create a new environment that suits that application, right? So it's built in the application. And it will provision a new application called my dog app. Let's see what will happen. So you can find that it has already created a new environment. So you have this my dog application is created. So what I want to showcase you here is that this gives you so much capabilities in terms of PowerShell gives you so much capabilities in terms of what you can do with Elastic Beanstalk. So this is one way that you can use it. So this PowerShell script that I have in my solution didn't take that much time to create. So all what I did was just went to the documentation of PowerShell scripts and then look for these commandlets. So we have to find them. So all what you need to do is to so this is the previous application version. You can go into search Google for AWS PowerShell commandlets, and you can find the reference for that, right? So if I go into the commandlet references, you can find like commands for different services. One of those services is of course Elastic Beanstalk. So what I did was I just went to these commands and explore, and they are self-explanatory. So for example, if I want to get environment information, I can call this function, create a new environment application, I can use this function, and you have a decent documentation that explains what are each parameters or which parameters that you are supposed to pass into them. VSTS or TFS use build agents to build your software. The hosted version of the Team Foundation server or the VSTS use hosted agents. You can of course connect your private agents into that, but in generally it uses hosted agents. So if you try to use hosted agents with VSTS, you provide access to Amazon assets through identity and access management user credentials. So that I already showed you how to create an IAM user, get the access key and secret access keys, and then add them in the build task. There may be some situations where you would like to use private agents on EC2. So if you use a private agent, which means that you install the VSTS or TFS agents on EC2, that agent may need access to different AWS resources. For example, if your agent is going to upload content into S3 bucket, of course it needs to have permissions to access the S3 bucket. If it's going to kickstart or deploy an Elastic Beanstalk application, it needs to have access to the Elastic Beanstalk application. If it's going to publish some CloudFormation template, it needs to have access to the CloudFormation engine. So the way to grant this is through EC2 instance roles. So how can you do that is the next question. In the TFS case, I have one of these build machine called SriDev TFS BM. So that's an EC2 instance that I use to build my artifacts. So here you can find that it belongs into a special IAM role called LF build server. So in this role, I have granted permissions to do certain tasks like S3 access, right? So if I go into my this role, you can find that I have granted a few permissions into that, right? So for Elastic Beanstalk, you can give Elastic Beanstalk access. So it has different permissions because I use the same build machine for S3 upload, for cloud core deployment. I use these permissions. So that's how you configured your build agents if you use a hosted version of Team Foundation server or TFS with private agents. That concludes the presentation. Hope you got a good understanding how you can integrate Microsoft development tools with Elastic Beanstalk. Thank you.